all been trapped in that specific kind of political debate. You know, the one usually happens about 3 pints in or halfway through a dinner party.
Oh, yeah, I know exactly the one you mean.
Someone brings up the House of Lords, and immediately the cynicism just comes pouring out.
It's the standard hot take, isn't it? What's the point of them?
Right. And there's always that one person, let's call him the constitutional nihilist, who leans back and says, look, it's all just theater. None of it really matters.
If the Lords say no, the Commons just ignores them.
Exactly. They just invoke the Parliament Act, override them, and push the law through anyway. It's sort of presented as the ultimate trump card in the argument.
It is, because it sounds like hard realism. It implies that the upper house is essentially, a debating society with good catering, but zero actual leverage.
That is precisely what we are digging into today, because that cynical take, it relies on a very specific assumption that the override mechanism is just a button you can press.
Like a skip ad button.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But we've been reading Power and Persistence, the Commons override mechanism, and it turns out that assumption is, well, wildly off base.
It's one of those things that's technically true, but practically very, very misleading. The source material for this deep dive does a great job of distinguishing between legal possibility and political reality.
Okay.
It argues that while the Commons can override the Lords, the cost of doing so is so high that it changes the entire geometry of how laws get made.
So the mission today is to figure out if our constitutional nihilist at the pub is actually right, or
Sure.
if he's missing, 90% of the iceberg that's underwater.
Yeah.
We're going to look at the mechanics of the Parliament Acts, this concept of political bandwidth, and the idea that power isn't just about having a final veto.
And we should state up front, this isn't an argument about whether the Lords should exist or be elected. We are looking purely at the mechanics of power as they actually exist right now.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds. The myth of the easy ignore. The basic understanding is Commons passes Bill A, Lords rejects Bill A, Commons says tough luck, and Bill A becomes law.
And if you look at the black and white letter of the law, specifically the Parliament Act of 1911 and then the amendments in 49, that is the end game.
Right.
The Commons is the elected chamber. It has the democratic mandate. The Lords is a revising chamber. If there is a deadlock, the elected house wins. Simple as that.
But the source material highlights that winning isn't instant, is it? We aren't talking about a procedure that takes a weekend.
Not even close. I mean, this is where the detail really matters. To override the Lords, you're generally looking at a delay of roughly a year,
A year,
usually stretching across 2 parliamentary sessions.
which in political terms is an eternity.
It's a lifetime. The government has to pass the bill in the Commons, send it to the Lords, get it rejected. Then they have to wait.
Just
Let a certain amount of time elapse. Then, in a new session of Parliament, they have to introduce the bill again.
from scratch.
They have to pass it through the Commons again, send it to the Lords again. And only then, if it's rejected a second time, can they go to the monarch for royal assent without the Lords' consent.
It's basically a procedural war of attrition. It's not a skip ad button. It's more like, I don't know, filing a lawsuit and waiting for the court date.
That's a much better analogy.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, a government's power usually relies on momentum. They win an election, they have a first 100 days plan.
They want to look dynamic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The override mechanism is the opposite of dynamic. It forces you to freeze a piece of legislation in amber for 12 months while the whole world changes around you.
And during that freeze, you have to keep making the argument for it. You can't just sort of shelf it and rub it back quietly.
No, you have to bring it back to the floor of the House, so you have to debate it again. The source actually calls this process deliberately awkward. It's designed to be a real grind.
It reminds me of those confirm dialogues you get when you try to delete a crucial file. Are you sure? Are you really sure? Type delete to confirm.
Yeah.
The Constitution is effectively asking the government, are you absolutely certain this is the hill you want to die on?
And historically, governments very often say no. That's the data point people miss. The Parliament Act has been on the books for over a century, right?
Yeah.
But it has only been successfully used a handful of times to force legislation through against total Lords opposition. We're talking about things like the War Crimes Act in 1991 or the Hunting Act in 2004. It's a very rare beast.
That rarity is what I want to drill into, because if the power exists, why not use it all the time? If I'm a prime minister with a big majority and the Lords are annoying me, why not just, conveyor belt my bills through this process?
And this is where we get to the absolute core of the source text, the cost of overriding. It's not free.
The text breaks this down into 3 main categories: time, bandwidth, and the paper trail. Let's tackle time first, because I think people really underestimate how rigid the parliamentary calendar is.
It's a zero-sum game when it comes to time in Parliament. There are only so many sitting days in a year. You have recesses, constituency weeks, budget debates. A government might have 20 big bills they want to pass in a session.
So it's an opportunity cost argument.
Precisely. If you are forcing a bill through the override mechanism, you are clogging up the pipes. You have to allocate floor time in the Commons for the second and third readings again.
You have to marshal your MPs to vote again.
Every hour you spend fighting to override the Lords on Bill A is an hour you are not spending passing Bill B, C, or D.
So if you're a minister, you have to ask yourself, is this one specific law important enough to sacrifice two other laws for?
And usually the answer is no, unless it's a huge flagship manifesto promise or something distinct like the hunting ban, which had massive backbench support. Most ministers will just look at that schedule and say, I just can't afford the delay.
Okay, then you have bandwidth. This feels a little bit more abstract, but the source makes it sound like a very tangible resource.
Think of bandwidth as political oxygen. A government only has so much capacity to manage news cycles, to manage public opinion.
Right.
When you trigger the override, you are effectively shining a massive spotlight on a conflict.
You're guaranteeing headlines that say, government at war with parliament, or constitutional crisis looming.
Which is rarely the headline a government wants.
Right.
They want headlines like, government delivers on promises, or economy booming.
Of course.
The override process is a slow, visible route, as the text puts it. It forces the government to publicly grapple with the objections raised by the Lords for months and months on end.
And we have to remember who is actually in the Lords. It's not just party appointees. You have former judges, scientists, ex-military chiefs.
Exactly.
So if the Lords is rejecting a bill on, say, surveillance tech, and the people leading the charge are former heads of intelligence or Supreme Court justices, that carries a lot of weight.
And that's the bandwidth drain. You have to send ministers out to TV studios to argue that they know better than the experts. You have to rip your MPs to vote for something that is being publicly shredded by people who know the subject matter inside and out. It just exhausts the government's energy.
Which brings us to the third cost, which I have to say I found the most fascinating. The paper trail.
This is the legacy cost. The source emphasizes that overriding the Lords is a public declaration of obstinacy.
It's putting it on the record, for good.
When you use the Parliament Act, you are explicitly saying, we have heard the warnings, we have seen the amendments, we understand the Lords think this violates international law or, hurts civil liberties, and we are choosing to do it anyway.
There's no plausible deniability later on. You can't just say, whoops, we didn't realize.
You signed the waiver. If you force through a law, let's use a hypothetical, that deregulates a financial sector, and the Lords warned you it would cause a crash, and then 5 years later the crash happens.
The opposition's job is easy.
They just have to point to the Hansard records. You ignored the safety warning, the flashing red light.
It's the difference between an accident and negligence. The override mechanism converts a policy failure into a deliberate choice.
And that fear, the fear of being explicitly, recordably wrong in the face of expert advice, that acts as a really powerful deterrent. It makes the cabinet pause. Are we sure the Lords are wrong? Are we sure enough to bet our legacy on it?
So if the government rarely uses this nuclear option because it's too expensive and too painful, what actually happens? Because the Lords does change laws. We see amendments all the time.
This is the pivot in our understanding of power. The pub argument assumes power is binary. It's either veto or nothing.
Yeah.
But the source argues for a model of influence.
The quieter form of influence.
It's the law of anticipated reactions.
Yeah.
Because the government knows the override is a painful slog, they will do almost anything to avoid it. So if the Lords say, we hate this whole bill, the government might fight. But if the Lords say, look, we'll let the bill pass, but you need to change Clause 4 and add an exemption for small businesses in Clause 10.
The government does the math.
They do the math. And the math is it worth a year of delay and all those bad headlines just to keep Clause 4 exactly how I wrote it?
And usually the answer is no. So they accept the amendment.
They compromise. The legislation changes not because the Lords blocked it, but because the government paid a ransom, in a way, to avoid the blockade.
That completely redefines the win condition. The Lords doesn't need to kill the bill to win. They just need to make the process of doing it so unappealing that the government negotiates.
And that's the ping-pong stage of Parliament you hear about. The bill goes back and forth. The Commons rejects the Lords' changes. The Lords insists on them.
And then what?
And usually, Around midnight on the last day of the session, a deal is cut. The government gets its law, but the Lords gets its safeguards.
The source mentions that this often acts as a form of high-stakes quality control. It's not just about political disagreements. Sometimes it's about actual drafting errors or unintended consequences.
Oh, constantly. Often the Lords will spot things like, this definition of terrorism is so broad it technically criminalizes librarians.
Which is probably not the goal.
The government doesn't want to criminalize librarians. They just wrote the bill in a rush.
Yeah.
So when the Lords points it out, the government isn't being defeated. They're being saved from their own incompetence.
Lords save government from embarrassing blunder isn't a headline you see very often, but it sounds like it happens behind the scenes all the time.
It accounts for a huge percentage of the amendments that get passed. It's technical scrutiny. And because the Lords don't have to worry about getting reelected, they can focus on the boring details that MPs might skip over because they're busy, campaigning.
So we've established that the easy ignore is a myth, but I want to zoom out to the constitutional design here. Why build a system that's this complicated?
Yeah.
Why have a chamber that can almost stop you, but not quite? Why not just give the Commons total supremacy immediately, or give the Lords a full veto?
It's the search for a Goldilocks zone in democracy. The source frames this as a deliberate tension between legitimacy and scrutiny.
Okay, break that down for us.
The Commons has legitimacy. They are elected. In a democracy, the will of the people, expressed through the ballot box, has to be the ultimate driver.
Of course.
You cannot have a room full of appointees permanently blocking the elected representatives. That would be completely undemocratic.
So the Commons must be able to win eventually.
Eventually. That's the key word. But, and this is a big but pure majoritarian democracy, can be dangerous. It can be impulsive. It can be populist, or just plain sloppy.
A government with a massive majority can succumb to groupthink.
Exactly. They can rush things through without thinking about the long-term impact.
And that's where the scrutiny comes in.
The Lords provides the friction. Their job isn't to stop the car. It's to check the brakes, check the map, and ask the driver, are you absolutely sure this is the road you want to go down?
It's a constitutional speed bump.
The system is designed so that the government can drive off a cliff if they really, really want to. But they can't do it by accident. They have to do it slowly, deliberately, and while listening to a GPS screaming, make a U-turn immediately.
I like this idea that the tension is baked in. We often view political conflict as a failure of the system. Oh no, they're arguing, nothing is getting done.
But the source suggests the argument is the work.
The friction is the point.
The friction creates the heat that refines the law. If a bill can slide through both houses without anyone raising a hand, it's probably not being read properly. The override mechanism is the safety valve at the very end of that process. It ensures that if there's a fundamental, unbridgeable disagreement, the elected side wins.
But only after they've paid the price.
Only after they've paid the price of explaining themselves, publicly and repeatedly.
It's like a transaction cost for bad legislation. Pause, explain, and pay.
And that transaction cost is usually high enough to force a compromise.
Before we wrap up, there's one final dimension in the source text that I think elevates this whole discussion. It asks us to look at the aging of these decisions.
This is the historical perspective. I found this part fascinating. The source asks, when the override power is actually used, when the government pays the price, takes the bandwidth hit, and forces a law through anyway, how does it look 10 years later?
Do we look back and say, thank goodness the Commons stood firm against those reactionary lords?
Sometimes. You could argue the War Crimes Act allowing prosecution of Nazis found in the UK was a moral necessity that the Lords blocked for, legalistic reasons. But often the override moments are the ones that age the poorest.
Because usually if the Lords are willing to block something to the point of triggering the Parliament Act, their objections probably aren't trivial.
Exactly. They aren't doing it for fun. They're usually flagging a significant constitutional or human rights concern. When a government overrides that, they are betting that history will vindicate them. But history has a funny way of siding with the people who said, hang on, wait, this is a bit dangerous.
So the paper trail we talked about earlier becomes the historical verdict.
It does. The mechanism ensures accountability. If the Lords had a full veto, the government could always blame them. They could say, we wanted to fix the economy, but the Lords stopped us.
The classic obstructionist excuse.
But with the override, the government has no excuse. They have the power. If they really want a law, they can get it.
So if they don't pass it, it's because they chose not to pay the price. And if they do pass it and it
It's
fails,
entirely on their heads.
yeah,
It strips away the excuses,
that's powerful. It puts the responsibility squarely on the elected shoulders.
which is exactly where it belongs in a democracy.
So let's circle back to the pub. Your friend, the constitutional nihilist, says, the Lords doesn't matter, the Commons can just ignore them. What is the one-sentence takedown?
You tell them. The Commons can't ignore them. They can only overrule them. And the difference between ignoring and overruling is about a year of bad headlines, a wasted legislative session, and a permanent record that you were warned.
It's not about stopping the train. It's about making the ticket so expensive that the driver thinks twice before leaving the station.
I think that's a very fair summary.
That's it for this deep dive. We've gone from it's all theater to understanding the high-stakes poker game of the Parliament Act.
It's always more complex and I think more interesting than the headlines suggest.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.